This week we have Dr. Jenny George teaching us about exploring the topic of rational happiness maximisers. Something really exciting, I'm really keen to hear, but part of Forums is we're a group from Melbourne Union Christian Union, and we're people who are interested in who Jesus is. So it's really great you could come along today. Jenny's going to speak, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion. So I hope you have a good time, and please give a warm welcome to Jenny.
Thank you. Let me, I'll just tell you a teeny bit about myself, and also to say I'm really, really happy for you to ask questions at any time. I will have a time for questions at the end as well, but if there's something that you just love me to expand on, or you kind of want to go down a rabbit hole somewhere, I'll tell you if I think it's off topic, but otherwise I'd love to have your input and feedback. So do feel free to ask questions. A little bit about me. I was at the University of Melbourne, actually at Melbourne Business School for about 18 years. Spent a lot of time there after doing a PhD in the US. And so I'm really interested in business and economics generally and the academic part of that. For the last 2.5 years, though, I've been the CEO of a mental health care company, which is a really big difference for me, but I'm absolutely loving it as well. And that's now led me into thinking about psychology in a slightly different way, because I now manage a group of about 200 psychologists and 1,800 contractors around the country, and we do a lot with mental health. So there's many things about human nature, human beings, that I'm interested in, and I'd just like to try and tease out for you today some of that. And I think the reason why it's a particularly important topic for all of us as people who live in this current world, but also for those of you who are in academia, even if only as students right now, but trying to sort through what you're being taught and the academic disciplines that are perhaps you're coming in contact with. I would say, by the way, let me preface this. I'm going to be generalising a lot today. In about half an hour, I cannot go into the deep nuances, which I promise you are in every discipline, and that have hundreds of years behind them. So I'm going to be shamelessly generalising and stereotyping, kind of for effect. But there will be kernels of truth in what I say. So if you kind of go, oh, is economics really that bad? No, it's probably not. There are really a lot of nuances. Is psychology really only about that? No, I'm going to be generalising, but hopefully doing it with some effect. And if you're troubled about something, ask me and we can talk about nuances of particular things as well. But I reckon the big topic of our day is, what are human beings? What is human nature? I think the big topics of 1,000 years ago was stuff like the nature of God, the nature of the world. What is the world? How can we understand it? Now, those haven't gone away. Those are still questions. But I would say the topic today that at least, not actually, not literally, but at least figuratively, people are being burned at the stake for, is not the nature of the sacraments. It's not, does the earth go around the sun? What is the big burning topic of our day is, what is a person? Who decides that? What is identity? What is human nature? I think those are the big topics of our day. And as people right now in the university, I think this will come up a lot. And I think that as Christians, we have a perspective on it that's worth thinking about, in contrast to some of the perspectives that you'll hear from different disciplines. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've seen as business and economics contribution to these questions. Can I ask who is studying anything in business and economics? Great. So feel free to ask questions, poke, prod, and pull me up on stuff if I'm being a bit too general. So I want to start with economics. Economics has been around for quite a long time. You could argue that it started before Adam Smith, but Adam Smith is certainly a key figure at the very start of thinking about economics. And economics, and by extension accounting and finance, which from a theoretical point of view are really underpinned by economics, has for a long time now been driven by mathematical modelling. So economics has a few people who would still be talking in kind of more general terms, but most economists now deal in the realm of numbers. And so by definition, any theories that economists have about people and the way people behave have to be able to be reduced to an equation. Now, what happens when you reduce human behaviour to an equation? You have to make a lot of assumptions. So the assumptions that economists mostly make about human behaviour are inevitably simplistic, but they essentially say that human beings firstly act in their own best interests. Now that's an assumption that psychologists do not make, but economists do. So the discipline of economics begins with humans act in their own self-interest, best interest, and they usually have to make some assumptions about what that kind of best interest is. Now, at its broadest, economists talk about best self-interest being what makes people happiest. Now, as Christians, we might start right there by saying, hang on, is our best interest our own happiness? Because economists just assume it is. As Christians, open question. However, in practice, happiness is extremely difficult to define because every single person is a bit different. And so in practice, economists usually define happiness as money. To be honest, about 90%, 95% of the models that you'll see in economics say we're happiest when we have the most money. Is this a good proxy? Well, kind of, and there's a reason why, and that is more money equals more choice. And if I have more choice, then that will probably maximise my happiness because, and here's the big headline for economics, choice is good. For economists, choice is the highest good, by definition. Because if I've got maximum choice, I must be able, say economists, to choose the best thing for me. Limit my choices, and perhaps I've limited what I can have, but maximise choice, and you must have maximised the possible best outcome for every human being. If every human being had infinite choice, every human being would be as well off as they would possibly be able to be. Now, I'm going to come back to that because Christians have a really different view about choice. If you have a read of Paul in Romans, Paul does not think choice is necessarily an unbridled good. In fact, Paul has quite a lot of interesting stuff to say about choice that does not mesh with economic models. But that's where economists go. And you can see how they've got there, right? How on earth are we going to solve a problem of putting this into a mathematical formula unless we make some assumptions? And this seems a pretty reasonable one. Because if I've got infinite choice, and if I'm the person who's able to self-maximise and choose the best thing for me, then infinite choice should mean that I get the most best possible outcome. Totally rational, logical, based on those assumptions, but Christians will have some stuff to say about that. So, in economics, we're assuming that people are rational. So we're assuming that they can make choices and they can make the best choice, that they know what they want. Again, psychology doesn't necessarily agree with this. They know what they want and choice is good. Choice is the greatest good that we can have. Economics, interestingly, is quite theoretical. It's based on assumptions. It's based on principles. It's quite principle-driven. But it's inevitably simplistic because it can only take into account what can be put into a mathematical model. Now, I think it's really worth understanding with modelling, and modeling's my world. I'm a data analytics person. What I do is modelling. Any model that you ever create is a simplification of the world. And it has to be in order to be useful. It's a little bit like saying, a map is a model of the real world, and it's a simplification because it doesn't have every single detail on it. But to be honest, a map that had every detail on it would not be useful to me because I actually can't carry the world around in my hands. I need something small enough that I can actually, make use of it. So models have to be useful, but they're going to be simplified and simplistic in order to be useful. So when you're thinking, well, what should I use a map for? you actually have to ask the question, what was the model created to do? It was created to help me find my way around the streets, and that's why some things are on there and other things aren't. So when we think about economic models, we also, and various others that we'll talk about in a moment, we have to think, what are they created for? Why are people trying to put human behaviour into a mathematical equation? Why have they put some things in and left other things out? And essentially for economics, the answer is that it's there to predict what will happen, usually on an aggregated view. This is not usually about predicting an individual, it's predicting a whole group of people. Sometimes it's a small subset of people. It's saying, what will the people who I make this particular offer to, or who come along to my particular business, what will they do? So sometimes it's a smaller subset, sometimes it's the whole economy. It's everyone in the country. Now, aggregating it up means that we don't need to worry so much about some of the little individual differences, and so the model works okay. It's actually useful for its purpose. So we need to ask, why are they creating the model, to understand why is the model including some things and leaving some other things out, and what's it been created for? It's been created to shape policy and to make decisions. So we're looking at economics and saying, okay, here's this model, it's simplistic and it's got a particular view of human nature. Going to move on. Marketing. Anyone doing anything with marketing? Yep, interesting. What are the marketing models out there? Well, some of them are actually based on economics, actually. So there's mathematical equations in marketing as well. But you do consumer behaviour, and that's much more based on psychology. What's the marketer's view of humanity? Infinite choice? Yeah, that's still in there. But the marketer's view of people is that people are consumers. And in marketing theory, the greatest good is being able to consume the most stuff. Again, generalising hugely. There are nuances, but I'm putting this out there as just a thing to help us start thinking about it. One of the things about marketing and a marketing model and approach to life is that when you overlay it onto many problems or issues, people get, in all their complexity, get reduced to consumers. So we see this when marketing gets included in the way hospitals think about things. Patients stop being patients and they become consumers. Students stop being students and they become consumers. Citizens, for politicians, stop being citizens and become consumers. Even boyfriends and girlfriends stop being boyfriends and girlfriends and become consumers when you have an app that makes money off people swiping. Seriously, we are now consumers. And a big complexity of human nature and the way people think about themselves has been reduced via a model into saying what we are people who pay to consume something. And that's our view of what that is. Now, why has marketing done that? Well, it's got a bit of a different aim to economics. Most of the time, marketers are not here to set policy. And they're usually not looking at people in quite the same aggregated sense. It's often a bit more individual. And why do marketers build their models? They build models to make money and sell people stuff. And so hence, we see a model that comes out looking much more pragmatic, much more observational versus principled. Economists start with a kind of a grand theory, if you like, about people. Marketers tend not to start with a grand theory. They tend to go, what makes people click? What makes people buy? Let's observe it, and let's do more of that because it's all about making money. So it tends to be a more observational, in that sense more real, actually. The models are often a little bit closer to reality because it's what actually works. But more pragmatic, less principled, and very much based on observation. Third model I want to talk about, or the third disciplinary lens on human nature, comes from psychology. Now, I'm not an expert here, but it's something that obviously I've been doing with my time the last few years. There are some movements in psychology that have significantly changed the way that psychology has operated for a long time. But certainly, at its beginnings, psychology was less about health and more about illness. So psychology often started from saying, why are people not well? Why are people dysfunctional? Let's see if we can figure that out. And so psychology's lens has tended to come from a lens of let's avoid dysfunction, avoid excessive anxiety or sadness or dysfunctional behaviours. Psychology aims to understand human behaviour and to treat mental illness, and that tends to be the focus. So psychological models have tended to have that purpose. So they're less about understanding what's positively good for human beings and more about understanding what can go wrong. Now that has changed a bit in the last 10 to 15 years with the positive psychology movement that was pioneered by Martin Seligman. And that was very much about saying, let's understand what's good for human beings. And so there's been a slightly different slant taken on that more recently, but still there's a very broad strand in psychology that's about understanding what can go wrong with humans. And what is a psychologist's theory about human beings and what makes a human being? Again, very broad statement, which you can take issue with, and I'm happy for you to nuance it, but people are kind of bundles of conscious and unconscious motivations and desires. And in that, what psychologists are interested in is how do I create myself, define myself, and take control of myself. And so a healthy, psychologically healthy person can control themselves, can control their desires, and can understand how to create their identity, if you like. So that's a sort of a psychology view. Right, I'm going to pause. Any questions? Because I've sort of put 3 views out there. Any things that you want to ask about, or I suppose challenges to it? There's lots of challenges you can make, by the way. I've been incredibly broad here. Yes?
I just like confused about the psychology part.
Yeah.
Like, because abnormal psych, maybe that's because of what you're saying,
Yeah.
but I'm in second year and we barely done any of that. Like, it's a lot about, like, what situations cause this behaviour, like,
Yep.
why do we, like, how do we develop, how do we behave
Yes.
in general.
Absolutely. So sorry, what's
Like, I don't know, I'm just a little bit confused. Could you just repeat what you said, actually?
Sure.
Like, how does psychology view humans in general?
So I said, I think, and this is a generalisation, that humans are a kind of a bundle of conscious and unconscious motivations and desires. And what we're aiming to do, both positive psychology and also treating kind of mental dysfunctions, is we want to help people to have control over that. So control over the way they respond and the way that they shape those motivations and desires and how that then becomes behaviour. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
So there's some theories. Now I suppose as a Christian, how do we sit with that? You're sitting in a lecture, you have done an entire term's worth of economics that has said, here's how we can predict what's going to happen in the economy. At what point do you as a Christian go, look, I'm not quite sure I agree that that's how humans behave? Firstly, I think any economist is going to go, yeah, I know it doesn't equate to everything about how humans behave, it's a model. So we do need to understand that all of these are models that are built to be useful. And any model that tries to do too much is not going to be useful anymore because it's going to be so complicated that you're not actually going to be able to practically use it for anything at all. So we need to acknowledge that to start with. However, I actually think that there are some reasons for us as Christians to be conscious about how these models are being implemented and how they might actually have some interesting effects. Now, the first thing I want to put out there And I'm going to come to what Christians believe about human nature in just a moment as well. But what I want to put out there is that this is totally anecdotal, but my observation is that people who continually use a particular lens, even rationally knowing that the lens is a model, end up actually behaving that way and starting to see the world, all of the world, that way and forgetting that there's more. I've had economist colleagues, and I'm not going to dob them in, but the more that you view the world through an economics lens, which essentially says, let's assume people act out of self-interest, the more you become self-interested and act out of self-interest. Anecdotal, I know, but I reckon there's something to it. You live in a world for a long time and you start actually becoming that and acting that way, and certainly start viewing other people's behaviour through that lens, even though if I were to say, you know, this is only a model, you go, oh, absolutely, I know it's only a model, I know it leaves stuff out. But you actually start kind of believing your own model. Same with marketing. I've had marketing colleagues who know that the world is much more than just consumption, who know that people are more than consumers, that patients are different from consumers, that students are not consumers, but they kind of start behaving as if the world is that way. So I think the first thing, and with psychology too, people actually start seeing often mental illness under every bush. And that's a bit of a problem. So I think the first thing that as Christians we ought to know and think about and care about is that we keep at the forefront of our minds a different view of human nature as being really important, because our own behaviour, our own view of the world will be shaped by the way, the lens we view it through. And if you are sitting there and you are viewing it through an economics lens day in and day out, can I tell you as a Christian, give yourself another lens. Spend time thinking and seeing the world through another lens, because otherwise you will become, to a certain extent, I think, the lens that you view the world through. So that's the first reason I think as Christians we should really engage with this. The second reason is I think that a Christian view of the world is better, more accurate, and will lead to better science, social science. Just as I think a Christian scientist who thoroughly believes in a God who creates order and who puts order into the world and believes that that order is able to be discovered through scientific endeavour, I think makes for a better scientist, which is, I think, why we see science taking off in the Christian centuries of Europe and not in many other countries of the world. Because I think Christianity makes you a better scientist, I think a Christian view of humanity will make you a better social scientist as well. Because there'll be stuff that you see that other people don't see. So that's the second reason I think it matters. It matters because it changes who you are, and it matters because it makes you better at your job. So, what is a Christian view of humanity? Does anyone want to just throw some ideas out here? Let's go interactive.
Image of God.
Yep, what do you mean by that?
We're made in the image of God.
Still didn't tell me what you meant, but yeah, so made in the image of God. Let's unpack that. Made in the image of God. So we're made. There's a start. What does image of God mean for our purposes here? What does it mean about human nature?
What would differ from the rest of creation?
We might believe that. I'm not absolutely sure that that sentence necessarily carries that. We're not told that other things aren't made in the image of God in this sentence.
We're meant to relate to God, so the image,
Yep.
some type of relationship.
Yep. Also, I'm not sure if it's absolutely in that sentence, but I agree with you, so we'll put it up.
Reflection of God.
Yeah, same problem. What does that mean?
We're creators.
Yeah. I actually think that's a very... this, by the way, is not an easy question. Lots of different answers. Lots of people have thought of lots of different things. But at least one of them, and actually there's a great essay by Dorothy Sayers, which is exactly on this, where she has an essay about the image of God and says what she thinks it means is that we are creators. Actually, Tolkien thinks that too. There's an essay he's written. So, so we are creators. That might be explicitly what is meant by the image of God. What else? What else about human nature do Christians believe?
We're rulers.
Sorry?
We're rulers.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Rulers of what?
Of God's creation.
Of creation? Yeah, and what does that mean?
So that it's up to us to take care, to take care of it. He puts, God puts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and they garden it.
Yep.
Kind of like that sense.
So, I'm going to take... This is something I wanted to say anyway. But firstly, we're made for work. So, human nature, we are workers. And we are caretakers somehow. Of creation. We'll come back to that because it's a bit fluffy, but that's all right. All good. What else?
We must have some kind of supernatural dimension. If it's
Yep.
in the image of God and God is supernatural.
So we are supernatural somehow?
That we have some kind of element to us that's not just physical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's true. Again, it's one possible implication of image of God, but there are probably some others as well. What about just other things? Made in the image of God, that's one thing. What about other things about human nature?
We're made for relationships.
Yep. What else?
We're made to worship.
Yeah, tell me about what that means.
Well, we're made to worship God, but sometimes, very often, we replace God with other things and, chase after them as if they were God or would fulfill us.
Yep. Okay. What else?
We rebelled against all of the above.
Yeah, I'm not going to go there quite yet because I'm going to go with well, we can do that. Okay, so we are fundamentally not what we were made to be, somehow. So there's kind of a war going on. Yep, all right.
We're moral, so we want to do what's good and not what's bad or evil.
That's weird.
So we're made to do good, yeah? Anything else? I've got a few others. I'll put them up here and see what you think. So I think we're made to enjoy beauty. I think we are made for justice, to care about fairness and justice, which is probably something to do with moral. I think we're made for self-sacrifice, actually.
Which probably comes under that we take on attributes of God.
Could be. Yep. And the last one, I think we're made for limited choices. Let me talk about that one for a second. So, if you read the New Testament, you'll see in there some really interesting stuff where it talks about some fundamental choices that we have. But the fundamental choices of human beings, says Paul at least in the New Testament, is essentially between slavery to sin or slavery to God. Now, what an interesting choice of words to use. So in other words, and often there's a lot of stuff that says freedom, perfect freedom, freedom of choice, freedom to be ourselves comes with slavery to God. So I am saying, and you can absolutely argue with me on this one, but I am saying that I think some of what's going on there is that we are not made for infinite choice. We're actually made to make one choice, basically, God or not God. And when we make the choice for God, says the New Testament, that limits our choices. It says there are things that are not consonant with that. There are things that if I make the choice for God, I will not be doing. I will not choose to do. I have now limited my choices, but that is what freedom is. So it's a fundamental difference from the underlying premise of our age in general and of our academic disciplines in social science in general, which is choice is good. So psychology is a little bit different on this because psychology will recognise that infinite choice is not necessarily good for us. That sometimes that actually puts us in a bit of a spin and leads to anxiety or other problems. So psychology is a bit different, but economics and business disciplines in particular that says all choice is good, more choice is better, infinite choice is infinitely good. Christians say absolutely not. Absolutely not. Choice is not good because actually infinite choice is almost an implication that I'm choosing away from God. Because if I want infinite choice, I am basically saying I'm going to choose myself. And I'm not going to choose God. As I said, I'm putting it out there. Argue with me if you like. But I think that that's a Christian perspective that is helpful to me anyway in saying, you know, what is it that's uncomfortable for me about the theory that all choice is good? Because I actually think that too much choice is bad for us. And even a desire for infinite choice is something that's fundamentally not Christian. Yes?
Sorry, just to clarify choice, do you mean choice as in number of options or choice as in the ability to choose options?
Both. But they're connected. So I think that what Christians say is, well, certainly, economics assumes everyone has the ability to choose options. So economic theory does not have a category unless it gets very, very complex in its modelling. It doesn't really have a category that says I don't have the ability to choose these options even though I have the options. If you've got the option, you can choose the option. Is the simplistic economics way of looking at it. In psychology, it's a bit more complex than that, because psychology might say, you've got the options, but something about yourself has now meant that you, in practice, actually can't bring yourself to choose that option because you're dysfunctional, actually. But in psychology, functionality, being a functional human being, means being in that situation where all of those options can be freely chosen, actually. Now, Christians, so here's where the nuance comes in. Christians don't say that being self-controlled is bad and being able to control your choices is bad. No, Christians agree with that. But I think that a theory that says all choice is good is going to be a lens that we view the world through that's going to be unhelpful for Christians. Because it's going to be a lens that says the way that I can improve my situation and improve the situation of people around me is to give them more and more and more choice. And Christians would say actually more and more choice is not necessarily the highest good for people. It's not necessarily the thing that is going to lead to their best outcomes. The infinite choice is not infinitely good because as human beings, more choice can ironically actually lead us to be less likely to choose what is good. And this is where Paul in Romans said there's some really interesting stuff about us having desires but not being able to choose the very thing we desire. And so there's some interesting stuff in the way Christians view the world that says just because I've got choices, A, doesn't mean that that's good, but B, more choices may in fact even be worse for me. So I think made for limited choices. And you could even see, anyway, yeah, I'll leave it there. So how does all of this then relate to those theories that we've got? None of the models that we see in the academy are wrong. Economics is not wrong. Psychology is not wrong. In fact, positive psychology in particular goes through most of these and affirms them. If you talk to people who studied positive psychology, they will say, yep, we know what makes for healthy people. They've got to be in relationships and need to build that. Oh, and by the way, they're going to enjoy beauty. That's going to be an important thing. By the way, self-sacrifice, that's important. And in fact, if people aren't doing something for others, they're going to get psychologically sick, which is true. So you'll find a lot of this is affirmed, but nevertheless, so these models are not wrong, they're just inadequate. And they're inadequate because they're models. So I guess what I'd really like to be making sure that we talk about today is, how are the models useful? How are they helpful? How are they unhelpful? And how should we as Christians interact with them, question them, and potentially change some of these paradigms? So I think we have problems for two reasons. We have problems when the model is confused with reality, when we actually start thinking that this model is true rather than inadequate but useful. And we have problems when the model shapes our thinking and turns us into the kind of people that the model depicts. So what do you think as Christians you need to do or might want to think about in light of this question of human nature and what are human beings? Where will you go with this? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that's right. So I guess I've put out some ideas, and the ideas are, here's the way that different disciplines view humanity. Here's what's inadequate about those. Here's a very quick sketch of some ideas about the way Christians view humanity. So can you think of ways that this might make a difference to you day to day? Let me tell you one for me. And so one of them that I think is quite important is that an economics lens, for me now as CEO in my company, says the way to treat people and to get the most out of them is by using cleverly devised incentives. That's what economics theory tells me. So if I want the most work out of people, I need to create the exact incentive for each person that will play to the things that they want to do and line up the things they do with what I want to do, with what I want them to do. Called principal agent theory, been around since the 1970s. And an economic view of the world says, all I need to do is get the incentives right, and then people's behaviour will be what I want it to be. Now, there's some truth in that. As a model, it's not completely wrong. Incentives do work, but it's inadequate as a way of viewing people. And one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't say, yeah, but actually, people are built for relationship, people are built for justice, and they're made for self-sacrifice. So actually, in my company, I could simply go around and attempt to create the best incentives for everyone, but not really pay attention to those other parts of their humanity. Or I could do what I did about a month or two ago and say to people, listen, something bad has happened. I won't go into details, but it did. Something bad has happened in the company. And I need to just ask from you that you will behave in these ways. And the reason I'm asking is because we collectively need to pull together. We need to respect each other, and we actually need to be, a good support for each other. So I'm not going to give you an incentive to do it. I'm not going to pay you more in order to behave a certain way. I'm not going to put, big sticks or carrots in this. I'm just going to ask you, as human beings who are wired for self-sacrifice in relationships, I didn't use those words, but of course, I'm going to ask you to actually behave in this way because that's the kind of company we want to be. Those are the kind of people we want to be. And not only was it effective, which it was, but it actually creates a different kind of conversation, and it creates one in which people's whole selves are able to be expressed, and in which people are no longer consumers, they're no longer economic agents. You're actually asking them to be their full self. You're asking them to express all of the things that makes them a human being and give them, in my opinion as a Christian leader, an opportunity to be the full person that God made them to be. So there's an example for me about how that might work out in practice. Can you think of any for you? You don't actually have to tell me. But what I want you to do is spend 2 minutes now and just think about how would not treating someone as one of these kind of two-dimensional models, how would that look? Let me pose you a potential situation. Some of you, even if you're not studying marketing, are going to find yourself in a company and you're going to be asked something like, how can we get more people to buy this? I promise you, about half of you. At some stage, someone's going to say, how can we bring more cash in by getting more people to buy it? Now, there's some different ways that you can view your customers. How are you going to do that? Will it make a difference to be a Christian when you think that way? And maybe it will and maybe it won't. But how will a fuller view of human nature potentially change the way you approach those questions? Many of you will probably be managers. How will you manage your team differently? Some of you will go on to actually create models that include human behaviour. Are there ways that you can model human behaviour? They'll still be models, they'll still be inadequate, but will there be ways that you can model human behaviour that will be closer to the full reality of human nature? I'll leave that with you. So, any questions? Yes.
So with all that said,
Yes.
which is really awesome, by the way. So thank you. But with all that said, like some of us like literally have class next hour where we talk about these models.
Yes.
And all those assumptions will come back.
Yes.
Yes, while we have this lens, how are we gonna, I guess, practically deal with talking about those models now in class?
Yeah. Look, it depends where you're up to. First and second year, go with it. But, as in, go with the models, but make sure that you are not viewing the world solely through that lens. Years 3, 4, master's level, start actually questioning how the models and when the models break down, and therefore what kinds of things should be done. Because the problem is, when you get beyond the simple models and you go to something more complex, and anything like this will be more complex, actually the maths get harder. So don't do it in first and second year when you're trying to build the foundations of the discipline. But later on, ask the questions. And, those of you who are doing economics will, you're coming across the work of Kahneman and Tversky, boundary rationality. They're psychologists, but they won a Nobel Prize for economics because they basically said people don't behave the way these economic models look. Let's build some new economic models, which they did. Some great stuff, prospect theory. Have a read. Kahneman and Tversky are the founders of the field. Actually, Tversky didn't win the Nobel Prize because he died by then, but Kahneman did. So have a read of that. There's some good work that can be done when you say, but hang on, that's not how human beings behave. So there are some great work, but it is more complex. So when you get to the point where you feel like you have enough knowledge of the base models to ask the questions, start saying, yeah, but how does this account for the fact that people are self-sacrificing? So, even in a conversation about capitalism versus Marxism, for example, there's a sense in which capitalism has assumed that people are selfish. Now, it turns out that as a model, that, while pessimistic, actually does work, because in the worst case scenario, where people are all basically being selfish, capitalism figures out how to kind of make that work. And by not being too optimistic about human nature, capitalism doesn't completely break down as soon as it discovers that actually people aren't good all the time. Okay, so there's some stuff there. But capitalism is not perfect either, because actually some people do want to act altruistically and be collective and not necessarily work in their own best interests. And capitalism has a hard time dealing with the whole concept of the family. There's all sorts of stuff that capitalism is not great at. Now, I'm not saying go in and have a Marxism versus capitalism argument, but I think that ask the questions about, so what happens when this model doesn't quite, account for the actual human interactions? How is it wrong? How much is it wrong? How can we, understand the gap between that reality and this model? And by the way, is the fact that our society continually talks in terms of the economic models actually turning our society into something we don't want it to be? Which is a conversation your economics lecturers won't have with you, but it's one to have with yourself. Yes?
A follow-up question, kind of.
Yes.
So assuming that we are at a level where we can think about those issues for ourselves, how much of it then should we try to persuade others of our perspective, knowing that this is from a Christian perspective, and those who don't really speak with are not Christians? So there's natural parts that they're going to reject, but we want to present our perspective in a Christian way. Like, should we do that? How should we go about doing that?
It's a great question. I think you'll find less pushback than you imagine, but depending on what language you use, because I don't think any of this is. I don't think any of this is that debatable, actually. I think this is true. And if it's true, and not just simply our wishful thinking, if it's actually true, then people will actually be able to discover it. Which is a bit why I think positive psychology has gone out and said, what actually causes human beings to flourish? That is literally the question they've asked. And what they've come up with, admittedly from an empirical base that didn't have any previous assumptions, and they could have saved a lot of time by reading the Bible, but nevertheless, what they've come up with is a list that looks like this. Even to the point of saying you need to have something transcendent that you relate to. They haven't called it God, but they've said this is what makes human beings flourish. So I think don't back off. Don't try and hide it. You don't need to put it in theological language. That will be off-putting. But don't back off from the, look, I think we should start understanding that actually human beings flourish when they do things for others and they're self-sacrificial, and let's figure out a way of building that into our models, because otherwise our models are going to be tragically wrong. That's a perfectly reasonable conversation to have, I think, if we believe and we see that this is actually true. If this is actually true, it should be demonstrable, I think. But the interesting thing, the interesting thing, and the reason I think Christians have a role to play here is because there are a bunch of people, positive psychologists apart, who are actually not even thinking of this stuff. They're not asking these questions. It's a blind spot, I think, for a lot of our disciplines and a lot of our thinkers. And I think Christians have the opportunity to have a really positive impact in saying stuff that's real, that's true, and improving the way that we talk about people, think about people, and actually making our approaches and our disciplines better, truer, and actually more useful. So I think we have a role to play, not for any other reason than we're actually thinking of some of this stuff that doesn't appear to be on the radar of other people as much. Sorry.
Now,
Thanks,
I'm
Peter.
sure that there's more questions, so are you going to stay around for a little bit
I can,
afterwards?
yes, absolutely.
So if you'd like to ask Jenny more questions, please just go up and talk to her afterwards. Is there any things that you recommend people to read or anything like that, just if they're like super keen and want to find out more?
Oh, that's a great question that I don't have an answer for on the spot. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well...
if I think of something, I will. I'll email it through. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's the kind of formal conclusion of forums for this week. We'll be on same place, same time for the rest of the semester. Next week is Michael Clark speaking on Christianity and evolution, which will be really, really interesting. And the week after, Sharon Chung is coming to speak about faith and the creative arts and work and so on. Yeah, I'd like to thank Jenny for coming, and we have a small gift for you.